everyone. My name is Halkias, and the idea to research behavioral economics for my capstone came about in a unique way. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Since behavioral economics is likely a foreign topic for all of you, I need to give a little background. There's no better way to do that than telling the story of how I personally came across the topic. This year, I elected to self-study microeconomics with a few other friends under the guidance of Mr. Thurston. In almost every question I worked through, the last sentence would read, "Assume all actors are perfectly rational." And basically what this means is that all the people in the problem make perfect decisions. And I always thought that assumption was unusual to make because in day-to-day life, we can all assume people acting irrationally in day-to-day life. I'm sure you guys have noticed this behavior, and it's quite possible that you yourselves act irrational from time to time, as we all fall victim to it once in a while. Keeping this in the back of my mind, I started doing a little bit of research on the field of economics. I quickly discovered that there is an entire area in the field dedicated to uncovering the predictable errors in human judgment. This area is called behavioral economics, and they do not assume people are perfect. Rather, they accept our flaws and adjust their models to make increasingly accurate predictions. According to Amos Tversky, behavioral economics seeks to put the human element back into the field of traditional economics. No longer does the problem have to assume people are rational, because that is not how it is in the real world. Scrapping optimal assumptions in favor of realistic behavior improves the accuracy of models used by the government, banks, and investors to benefit everyone economically. So one of the most fun ways to prove irrational behavior exists is to play a game that two people coined, a game with two people that German economist Werner Guth coined the ultimatum game. So I need two volunteers. Okay, let's use this. All right, so one of you guys needs to be the proposer, and one of you needs to be the responder. So, you want to be the proposer? Okay. So, I'm going to give you $165.
All right. I think I know what this is.
Oh, you do? Okay.
No,
whatever.
keep talking.
Keep doing. So, if this was a real research project, you get to keep the money, but I'm going to college next year, so I need that back. You're just in front. Okay, so here's how the game works. You have to decide how you want to split the money between you. The only catch is, if Miss Eustace declines your offer, you give the money back to me. But if she accepts it, you guys both walk away with the money. So, how would you choose to split?
How much is here?
165.
Do we get to decide together?
No.
Oh.
It's all on him.
I mean, I can give you like $10. No, obviously I'd want to split it both ways. So split it half and half. But there's no actual change here. So here. So it's 165 divided by 2. That's 82.5. So here, you can take $80 and then that'll still help. But I still have
How much do you have? Am I allowed to ask him?
No.
So yeah, I still have $85. So I can't give you change. So I'm going to keep this.
You accept it? Okay, so if this was an actual research experiment, you guys would be the outliers because you accepted the offer, because he went 50-50, right? Well, the best he could. That's why I did 165, so you couldn't split in half. But what this game reveals, oh, you guys are good. I can take it back.
I thought you said we had to.
No, I thought we were going to college. Thank you. Okay, so if Jack chose his original offer, which was to give Miss Eustace $10, Miss Eustace, would you have taken it?
No.
Okay, so that was what I was trying to get at, and I was hoping you were actually going to do that, because the game reveals what fiduciary Kweku Obed refers to as an emotional bias. Humans have a tendency to let their emotions influence their financial decisions. A rational person would take any amount of money, even if it was only $1, because a gain is a gain to them. So if Miss Eustace declined the $10, she'd be acting irrationally, because that's $10 more than she had before. So we see this happen in the real world as emotions influence consumer decisions all the time. People may be reluctant to purchase from a certain company, not because their product is bad, but rather because they emotionally disagree with the viewpoints and beliefs of that company. See Chick-fil-A, for example. Their product and service is amazing, but some people still do not buy from them because they disagree with what the company stands for religiously. This bias is not accounted for in traditional economics, as they assume people will always make the optimal decision. But in reality, some people are willing to pay a little more to support products and services that represent viewpoints in accordance to their own. See in Katie's presentation with the organic peanut butter. Another major pitfall of predictable human behavior is letting sunk costs influence decisions for the worst. A sunk cost is money spent that ultimately never serves a purpose. For example, if I spend $100 to watch the New England Patriots play, but on the day of the game, it is snowing so hard that I cannot make the drive to Foxborough, that $100 is a sunk cost. Now this might seem negligible, and that is exactly what traditional economics thought, but that is far from the truth. The emotional behavior that follows a sunk cost must be controlled. I read an article titled "The Red and the Black" by George Lowenstein that explains how humans tend to keep a mental account of the transactions they make. When someone experiences a sunk cost, their mental account becomes out of balance and they look to correct it by seeking out deals, often just by spending money that does not need to be spent. When I was writing the annotated bibliography for this article, two ideas came to mind. The first was that George Lowenstein, the author of the article, is a professor of economics and psychology at Carnegie Mellon University. The second was that I was still confused as to how sunk costs can be devastating to our economy. I needed a real-world example, so I reached out to Professor Lowenstein, who I'll most likely have next year in his class. I'll most likely be in his class. And I noted how I understood what he was saying, but I still didn't get why sunk costs negatively influenced society as a whole. The answer I received stemmed mostly from people in power. He drew on an example from United States history when President Lyndon B. Johnson and his White House advisors fell victim to sunk costs when it came to the Vietnam War. The president committed so many troops, money, and resources and got nothing but negative public opinion ratings in return, as no progress was made. At that point, all those resources were sunk costs, and instead of just recognizing and moving on, President Johnson continued to spend more year after year. The decision was emotionally charged, as he did not want anything to go to waste, but in pushing unnecessarily to correct his decision, more was wasted. All these extra resources spent by our government to continue a war that we were losing could have been avoided if emotions surrounding sunk costs were contained. The goal of a behavioral economist is to prove common irrational behavior exists, offer a psychological explanation of why it occurs now and why it will continue to occur, and finally to apply discoveries to traditional economics in order to spark change. Their new findings revolutionized the field of economics, which was scary for professors and students who were educated in the field of traditional assumptions. An analogy Richard Thaler likes to make is to think of how math teachers would feel if young scholars came up to them and said that their methods were outdated. There was a debate at the University of Chicago Business School between a behavioral team that sought change and a traditionalist team that wanted to keep everything the same. A famous line from that meeting is when Nobel Prize economist Merton Miller argued that if the behavioral team's ideas were true, it would put himself and countless others out of work. The behavioral side responded by saying, they are not trying to harm the field, but rather change it for the better. And just like any major new discovery to an existing field, it requires an adjustment for all. For me, I will use my knowledge of behavioral economics next year to have insightful conversations with professors who devoted their careers to the field. That is not all I'm taking from this project, however. After doing all this research, I noticed myself becoming a more rational consumer. In educating myself on the many predictable errors in human judgment, I learned to catch myself when I am close to falling into one of those traps. I hope that is something you all got from this presentation. Next time you go shopping, be aware if there's any emotional bias attached to the products you are buying. Next time you experience a sunk cost, just move on because there's nothing you can do about the past. On May 17th, I took my microeconomics exam, and I can only smile when I saw the problems that assume people are fully rational. Because in the back of my mind, I knew that wasn't true, and that the entire academic field of behavioral economics was fighting against it. Uncovering and understanding flaws is much more useful than simply assuming they do not exist. Thank you. Questions?
So this clearly, like, I did not know about any of this before, and it makes sense, but is this like some field that's in like loads and loads of places? Like, does the government have behavioral economists on their staff, and do universities, and like, is this a thing that's everywhere?
Yeah, and it's just getting started. So Carnegie Mellon, the school I'm going to, they just offered a major in behavioral economics 2 years ago, so it's relatively new. And the government's having on their website, it says the government has high demand for behavioral economics because they're trying to adjust their models to kind of make them more accurate, because they need to take into, old economics didn't take into account the psychology, but this new revolutionary idea is taking that into account. So the government needs to adjust their models to make it more accurate. So yes, it is in high demand.
Wow. Where do you think you'll take it?
I have no idea right now. I'm going to the business school as a undeclared major, so maybe this or maybe accounting or another one. You declare your sophomore year, so I'm not sure right now, but maybe a little later.
What percentage of consumers would you estimate are irrational?
So the book I read called Misbehaving by Richard Thaler, he said 75%. And the other 25% are educated in business and economics. That's the joke he likes to make, so 3/4. Don't remember that stat correctly. It's something high like that. She says.
Did you come across any, concrete examples of just how it's negatively, how not taking the psychology into it has had a negative impact? I know you gave that one example.
On history? Yeah, so for people in power, it's huge. You can't have any emotional bias attached to the products you're buying. It influences our decisions, say, like in a grocery store. If people go to the store and they're actually buying those organic products that are actually more expensive, that's going to impact our economy differently than assuming that we're going to be rational and just buying the cheapest thing every time. So they're arguing that we're not rational and that our models are false in assuming that. So it's going to negatively impact those predictions on interest rates and things along those lines by making those assumptions. That's all I got. Thank you.